My dead brother knocked on my door after 50 years. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when the phone rang. After 35 years of teaching high school English, I could usually tell by the tone whether a call would bring good news or heartbreak. This one felt different. Heavy, like the air gets right before a tornado touches down in Texas. The woman on the other end had a professional voice, but there was something gentle underneath it. She introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, a private investigator calling from California. Then she asked about my brother, David Morrison. My red pen froze over a student's essay about family traditions. Morrison. I hadn't heard my maiden name in decades, not since I'd married Tom and become Linda Harrison. I told her my brother had died in 1973 when he was just 3 years old. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What she said next made my world tilt sideways. David hadn't died. He was alive, and he'd been looking for me. The kitchen seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of my grandmother's old oak table, the one Tom and I had refinished when we were newlyweds. My breathing got shallow, like when I'd had that panic attack after Mom's funeral 5 years ago. But alive? How could Davy be alive? I'd watched them lower his tiny white casket into the red Texas earth at Westland Cemetery. I'd thrown dirt on top of it with my own 8-year-old hands, my Sunday dress stained with tears and mud. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through my shock. She told me something that made even less sense. My brother was an incredibly talented artist. His work had been displayed in galleries from New York to Los Angeles, though not under his own name. She needed to meet with me in person. Could I come to California? I hung up and sat alone in my empty kitchen, staring at the photographs covering my refrigerator door. Pictures of my own children, Jessica and Michael, now grown with families of their own. My grandchildren's school photos and soccer team pictures, Christmas mornings and birthday parties and graduations. 50 years of family memories, but always with that invisible, empty space. The place where Davy should have been. That evening, I called Jessica. She lived just 20 minutes away in Cedar Park, close enough that she still came over every Sunday for my pot roast and homemade rolls. Jessica thought I was losing my mind. Grandma and Grandpa would never have lied about something like Davy's death. She insisted. Someone was obviously trying to run some kind of elaborate scam on a lonely widow. She reminded me about all those news stories of con artists targeting older women, especially ones who'd recently lost their husbands like I had. But I couldn't stop thinking about Davy's eyes. Those enormous blue eyes that seemed to take in everything, but couldn't find the words to tell you what he saw. How he used to line up his Hot Wheels cars in perfect rows across our living room floor, organized by color and size. How he would rock back and forth in his little wooden chair when Daddy raised his voice at the dinner table. How he never spoke a single word, but somehow I always knew exactly what he needed. Mom had tried to explain it to me after the funeral. In that careful way, adults talk to children about things they don't really understand themselves. She said Davy had something wrong with his brain, something the doctors called a developmental disorder. It was a blessing that the Lord had taken him young, she'd whispered while braiding my hair for school. He never would have been able to live a normal life like other children. I'd carried that guilt for 50 years. The big sister who couldn't protect her baby brother. The one who was supposed to watch out for him but somehow failed. Friday morning, I called in sick to the substitute teaching service I'd been working with since retirement. By noon, I was on a Southwest Airlines flight to Los Angeles, clutching Sarah Mitchell's business card and a photo of 3-year-old Davy that I'd kept in my wallet for half a century. Sarah met me at LAX baggage claim. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of confident handshake that comes from years of delivering difficult news to families. During the hour-long drive up the Pacific Coast Highway to Malibu, she told me everything. The famous artist, Richard Stone, had died 3 months earlier from a massive heart attack. He was 78, wealthy beyond measure, and celebrated for landscape paintings and abstract works that hung in museums from the Metropolitan in New York to LACMA in Los Angeles. His estate was worth tens of millions of dollars. But when the lawyers started settling Stone's affairs, something didn't add up. She showed me a photograph while we sat in traffic near Santa Monica. A man in his early 50s with familiar blue eyes stood in an art studio, holding a paintbrush covered in vibrant orange paint. My heart nearly stopped beating. The baby face was gone, replaced by strong cheekbones and graying hair at the temples. But those eyes were exactly the same. Eyes that held secrets and dreams and 40 years of questions I couldn't answer. Sarah explained about the art expert named James Collins, who'd been hired to evaluate Stone's collection for estate sale. Collins had noticed something troubling about the chronology of Stone's work. The early pieces from the 1960s and 70s were competent but unremarkable. Then suddenly, starting in 1985, the quality became extraordinary. Not just better, completely transformed. She pulled out more photographs, paintings that took my breath away, even in reproduction, swirling blues and greens that seemed to move on their own. Portraits of strangers that somehow captured more emotion than most people showed in real life. Abstract compositions that spoke directly to something deep in your soul. Collins had gotten suspicious about the dramatic change in artistic ability. When he'd returned to Stone's Malibu house for a final inventory, he'd discovered David painting in a converted garage studio. The brushwork was identical to Stone's later period masterpieces. That's when Collins realized he was looking at one of the biggest art frauds in modern history. For 40 years, Richard Stone had been selling David's paintings under his own name. They estimated my brother had created over 300 works that brought in more than $15 million. David had lived in that garage, essentially kept as a prisoner, with a caretaker who barely spoke English, while Stone became rich and famous from stolen talent. The house in Malibu sat on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the kind of place you see in movies about wealthy people. Sarah parked her Honda Civic behind a black Mercedes that probably cost more than I'd made in my last 2 years of teaching combined. A Hispanic woman in her 60s answered the front door. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she seemed relieved to see us. Maria introduced herself as David's caretaker, then told us she'd been taking care of him for 20 years. She said he talked about me every single day, repeating my name like a prayer. Linda, Linda, Linda. He'd never forgotten his big sister. Maria led us through rooms that belonged in Southern Living magazine. Original paintings covered every wall. Bronze sculptures stood in alcoves. Persian rugs that probably cost more than my car, stretched across hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors. But all that wealth felt cold and empty compared to what waited in the backyard. Through the window of the small guest house, I saw him. David sat at an easel, completely absorbed in the canvas in front of him. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face showed the lines that come with 53 years of living. But his profile was exactly the same as the toddler in my memories. He was painting a sunset in shades of orange and pink that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Maria knocked gently on the studio door. David looked up, and our eyes met through the glass. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across 50 years of separation. Then his face slowly broke into a smile. That same shy, crooked grin I remembered from when he was learning to walk and would clap his hands when he managed 3 steps without falling down. He stood up and walked to the door with careful, measured steps. When Maria opened it, he reached out and very gently touched my cheek with paint-stained fingers, as if he needed to make sure I was real and not just another one of his dreams. Then he started humming, a melody I hadn't heard in 50 years, but recognized instantly. The lullaby I used to sing to him at bedtime when Mom and Daddy were fighting downstairs. Hush now, my Davy, close your eyes. Tomorrow brings a new day for playing and sunshine. I broke down crying right there in that doorway. All those years of guilt for not protecting him, for letting him die, for moving on with my life while he was gone. And he'd been here the whole time, remembering me, hoping for me, waiting for me to find him. Maria told me the story, while David showed me his paintings, pointing to different canvases and making soft sounds of pride. Her English was accented but clear. Shaped by decades of living in California after emigrating from El Salvador in the 1980s. Richard Stone had found David at the Riverside State Children's Center in 1985. David was 15 then, and he'd already been showing artistic promise. The staff at the institution thought he was just a strange boy who liked to draw pictures of flowers and trees and birds. Stone had presented himself as a philanthropist who wanted to help gifted children with special needs. He'd filled out all the proper paperwork, met with social workers, convinced everyone that he could provide David with opportunities he'd never get in a state facility. And in some ways, he had. David got the finest art supplies money could buy, professional easels and brushes and paints imported from Europe, a studio with perfect natural lighting, everything a serious artist could want. But the cost had been terrible. Stone had isolated David from the outside world completely. He told neighbors and visitors that his adopted son was too mentally ill for company. He'd taught David to sign paintings, R. Stone, and convinced him that was just how things worked in the art world. Nobody would buy paintings from someone like David, Stone had explained. This was the only way his beautiful work could reach people who would appreciate it. I walked around the small studio, looking at paintings that covered every available wall space. Each one was a masterpiece. Landscapes that captured the soul of California's coastline. Abstract pieces that seemed to express emotions I didn't have words for. Portraits of Maria and other people who must have been kind to David over the years. David couldn't speak many words, but he could paint feelings that the rest of us barely understood how to name. Maria explained his daily routine which hadn't changed in decades. David woke up every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. He ate breakfast at 7, always oatmeal with honey and sliced bananas. He painted from 8 until noon, took a lunch break, then painted again from 2 until 6 in the evening. Dinner at 7, bedtime at 9. The same schedule every single day for 40 years. Stone would come by once a week to collect finished paintings. He never told David where they were going or how much they sold for. He'd just take them away and bring new blank canvases, like David was some kind of painting machine, instead of a human being with feelings and dreams. When Stone died of his heart attack 3 months earlier, David had kept painting. He didn't understand that his father was dead. Maria hadn't known how to explain death to someone who processed the world so differently. She just kept taking care of him, hoping someone would figure out what to do next. That someone turned out to be Bradley Stone, Richard's biological son from his first marriage. Bradley was in his early 40s, a real estate developer from San Diego, who'd barely spoken to his father in 20 years. But now that the old man was dead, Bradley suddenly wanted everything. His plan was simple and cruel. He'd have David declared incompetent and placed in a state facility. The Malibu house would be sold. All the paintings would be auctioned off as authentic Richard Stone originals. David would get basic state care and nothing else. Bradley had threatened to have Maria deported if she interfered with his plans. She'd been working without proper documentation for years, and she was terrified of being separated from David, who depended on her for everything. That's when James Collins entered the picture. Collins was an art expert with 30 years of experience, authenticating paintings for insurance companies, museums, and private collectors. He'd seen thousands of forgeries and copies and questionable attributions in his career. But when he studied Stone's collection, he noticed something that bothered him deeply. The early Stone paintings from the 1960s and 70s were technically competent, but lacked soul. They looked like the work of someone who'd learned proper technique but had never felt passionate about his subjects. Then, starting in 1985, the paintings suddenly became brilliant, not just improved, completely transformed. At first, Collins had assumed Stone had studied with a master or experienced some kind of personal breakthrough. That happened sometimes with artists. A divorce, a death in the family, a spiritual awakening. Life changes could dramatically improve someone's work. But the more Collins studied the paintings, the more convinced he became that they'd been created by two entirely different people. The brushwork was different. The color mixing was different. Even the way the paint was applied to canvas showed completely different motor skills and muscle memory. It was like comparing paintings by Picasso to finger paintings by a kindergartner. Collins had returned to the Malibu house for one final walkthrough, and that's when he'd seen David in the studio, painting a seascape that perfectly matched the style of late-period Stone. The brushstrokes, the color palette, the emotional intensity, everything matched exactly. Collins realized he was witnessing one of the largest art frauds in contemporary history. He'd immediately contacted the FBI's art crime team, but the legal situation was incredibly complex. David was a documented disabled adult under legal guardianship. Proving exploitation would be difficult, especially since Stone was dead and couldn't defend himself or be prosecuted. But Collins was determined to see justice done. He'd hired Sarah Mitchell to track down David's biological family. If David had relatives who cared about him, They could fight for his rights in ways that outsiders couldn't. Sarah had traced the paper trail through state institution records and adoption documents. It had taken weeks of digging through archives and cross-referencing old files, but she'd finally found the record of David Morrison, placed in state care in 1973 by parents who claimed they couldn't handle his special needs. There was no record of death. Just a 3-year-old boy signed over to the state of California. From there, Sarah had tracked down my school records from Austin ISD. Linda Morrison, sister to David Morrison. Then she'd followed my life through marriage certificates, voter registrations, teaching licenses, and property records, until she found Linda Harrison in Austin, Texas. While we talked, I watched David paint. His concentration was absolute, like he could see colors and shapes that were invisible to everyone else. Every brushstroke was deliberate, purposeful. He wasn't just painting a picture, he was creating a window into another dimension where beauty made perfect sense. Maria told me he painted every day, rain or shine, happy or sad. When he ran out of canvas, he painted on cardboard. When the cardboard was gone, he painted on paper. When there was no paper left, he'd trace pictures in the air with his finger, his eyes following invisible masterpieces that only he could see. Art wasn't just a talent for David. It was his language, his way of understanding the world and communicating with it. Stone had understood that. That's why he'd kept David hidden away from everyone. He'd known that if the art world discovered the true creator of those masterpieces, his own reputation would be destroyed overnight. Collins showed me financial records he'd found in Stone's home office. Over the past 40 years, David's paintings had sold for more than $15 million. Museums had paid hundreds of thousands for single pieces. Private collectors had competed in bidding wars for the chance to own authentic Richard Stone originals. David had never seen a penny of that money. Instead, he'd lived in a converted garage with a narrow bed, a hot plate, and a small television that only got 3 channels. Maria had tried to make it comfortable with colorful blankets and pictures cut from magazines, but it was still essentially a prison cell. Meanwhile, Bradley Stone was getting more aggressive about his timeline. He'd hired lawyers to expedite the process of having David committed to a state facility. He wanted to sell the house and paintings quickly, before anyone could challenge the inheritance. But now David had family who would fight for him. I spent 3 days with my brother in California, and every moment was like unwrapping a present I'd thought was lost forever. David couldn't say many words, but he remembered things that broke my heart and put it back together at the same time. He remembered our dog Rusty, a golden retriever who'd slept at the foot of my bed and let Davy pull his ears without ever snapping. He remembered the swing set in our backyard, the red one with the slide that had a crack down the middle. He remembered how I used to read him picture books about farm animals, doing different voices for the cows and pigs and chickens. At one point, he brought me a small sketchbook filled with drawings he'd made over the years. Simple stick figure drawings of 2 people, one tall and one short, holding hands. Under each drawing, he'd written one word in careful block letters: Linda. For 40 years, he'd never stopped believing I would find him. I also met with Collins, who explained the art world that David had unknowingly become part of. Richard Stone paintings hung in major museums across the country. The Whitney Museum in New York had 3 pieces in their permanent collection. The Art Institute of Chicago had paid $2 million for a landscape that was actually David's interpretation of the view from his studio window. Private collectors had built entire rooms around Stone's later work. Investment funds had bought and sold his paintings like stocks. Art students wrote their master's theses analyzing Stone's artistic evolution and mature period breakthrough. None of them knew they were really studying the work of an autistic man who'd been kept like a secret for 40 years. The news of the deception sent shockwaves through the art world. Galleries scrambled to figure out which works were authentic Stone's and which were David's creations. Some collectors demanded refunds. Others said they didn't care who had actually created the art. It was still beautiful, still meaningful, still worth owning. But for me, this wasn't about art or money or reputations. This was about my brother, who'd lost 50 years of his life because of other people's fears and greed. I hired a lawyer in Los Angeles and began the long legal fight for David's rights. Bradley Stone contested everything, claiming David was too disabled to live outside an institution, that he was a danger to himself and others without professional supervision. But we had evidence that proved otherwise. Maria testified about 40 years of peaceful, productive behavior. Collins testified about the sophistication and emotional depth of David's artwork. Autism experts explained that many people on the spectrum could live fulfilling, independent lives with appropriate support systems. The case attracted national media attention. Stories about the exploited autistic artist spread across newspapers, television, and social media. Disability rights advocates rallied around David's cause. Art critics began reevaluating Richard Stone's legacy and questioning how many other famous artists might have built their careers on stolen work. Some of the paintings attributed to Stone were reattributed to David. Museums updated their wall plaques. Galleries began promoting newly discovered works by David Morrison, though of course they'd never actually been lost, just hidden. The hardest part was understanding what our parents had done. I found their old correspondence in boxes stored in my childhood home's attic, which I'd inherited when Mom passed 5 years ago. Letters from the institution, medical records, financial documents. The story slowly pieced itself together like one of David's complex paintings. In 1973, doctors had told my parents that David had childhood autism, a diagnosis that was poorly understood back then. They'd been told he would never be normal, never be able to live independently, never hold a job or have a family. He would be a burden on our household for the rest of his life. My parents had been young and scared and ashamed. In the early 1970s, autism was still blamed on refrigerator mothers, who supposedly didn't love their children enough. Neighbors whispered that it was God's punishment for some hidden sin. Church friends distanced themselves. Daddy worried it would affect his job at the insurance company. So they'd made what they thought was the best decision for everyone. They'd placed David in the state institution and told me he'd died from his brain condition. They'd even held a funeral service with an empty casket to make the lie convincing enough that an 8-year-old wouldn't ask too many questions. They'd planned to visit David regularly, but the institution staff had discouraged it. Visits would only upset him and make adjustment harder, they'd been told. Better to let him forget his old life and adapt to his new reality. Years passed. David adapted to institutional life. My parents adapted to life without him. The lie became their truth. When Stone had offered to adopt David in 1985, my parents had been relieved. Finally, their son would have a chance at something better than state care. They'd signed the papers giving Stone complete custody and never looked back. They'd never known about the exploitation. They'd never known about David's artistic genius. They died thinking they'd done the right thing for a child they'd loved but couldn't understand. Understanding this was almost harder than discovering David was alive. I couldn't stay angry at my dead parents for a decision made out of love and fear and ignorance. But I also couldn't forgive the lie that had cost all of us so much. The court case lasted 8 months. In the end, the judge ruled that David was capable of making decisions about his own life with appropriate support. He could choose where to live and who to trust with his care. David chose to come home to Texas with me. We converted Tom's old workshop into an art studio, installing the kind of lighting and ventilation that would make any artist jealous. David paints every day now, but his work is signed with his own name. A local gallery in downtown Austin hosts exhibitions of his pieces every few months, and the money from sales goes into a trust fund we established to support other artists with autism. Maria moved to Texas to continue caring for David, and she's become family in every way that matters. My children and grandchildren adore Uncle Davy, who draws them pictures of their pets and remembers every birthday without being reminded. David still doesn't talk much, but he doesn't need to. His art speaks for him more eloquently than words ever could. Every painting tells a story about the beauty he sees in ordinary things, about the love he feels for his family, about the hope he never lost even in his darkest years. Some evenings, we sit on my back porch while David sketches the sunset, and I tell him about all the family gatherings he missed. I show him photo albums from Jessica and Michael's childhoods, their graduations and weddings, and the births of their own children. He studies each picture like he's memorizing faces, storing up 50 years of love he wasn't allowed to receive. Sometimes I sing him the old lullabies, and he rocks gently in his chair and smiles, just like he did when he was 3 years old. For 50 years, I'd carried the weight of failing to protect my little brother. Now I understand the truth. He didn't need protection. He needed love and understanding and the chance to share his gifts with the world. He got all of that eventually, even if it wasn't in the way he deserved. Bradley Stone finally agreed to settle out of court when the media attention became too damaging to his real estate business. David received half the value of all paintings sold under his father's name since 1985, several $1 million that my brother had earned through his talent and stolen labor. But the most valuable part of the settlement was getting back the paintings themselves. David now owns many of his original works, and they hang throughout my house, properly signed with his real name. Every morning, I wake up and see my brother's art on my walls. It's a reminder that love can overcome any lie, that talent will find a way to shine even in the darkest circumstances, and that family is more than just blood relationships. It's the choice to keep caring, even when the world tells you to give up. David lost 50 years of his life, but he never lost himself. His spirit, his talent, his capacity for love remained untouched by all the exploitation and isolation. Now he's surrounded by people who value him for who he is, not what he can create for their benefit. And for the first time in 50 years, we have family photos with Davy in them again. His smile is still shy, his eyes are still kind, and his love is still as unconditional as it was when he was 3 years old. Sometimes the best stories are the ones with happy endings, even when they take half a century to unfold. My little brother has come home.